It all started on a typical Friday night, exactly 7 years after our wedding day. I came home from work, expecting the usual routine: dinner, maybe a movie, and bed. My wife, Jessica, was already sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a glass of wine, which was odd since she wasn't much of a drinker. I immediately sensed something was off. Her body language was tense, and her eyes avoided mine, darting around the room like she was trapped. "Sit down, Tom," she said, her voice surprisingly calm, but her words felt heavy, like there was something lurking beneath the surface. Jessica wasn't known for being rude or harsh, but there was an edge to her tone that night I hadn't heard before. I sat down across from her, not sure what to expect. After all, we'd been together for years. Everything seemed fine on the surface. We had a nice house in the suburbs, both had stable jobs, no kids but a dog we treated like one, and we hadn't really had any major issues. Sure, we had our fights, but who didn't? She took a deep breath, then began speaking slowly, like she was reading from a script in her head. "Tom, I haven't been honest with you for a long time." My heart skipped a beat. Instantly, my mind went to the worst possible scenario. Had she been lying about money? Was she in debt? My head swirled with possibilities. I didn't expect what came next. "I've been seeing someone else for years." The room fell silent, except for the sound of my heart pounding in my chest. The words hung in the air like thick smoke, choking me. I felt like I had been punched in the gut, the wind knocked out of me. Years? This wasn't just some one-night mistake. This was something deeper, something long-term. I couldn't speak. The shock paralyzed me. But Jessica kept going, her voice steady, though her eyes had that defiant glint that I had rarely seen. "You know Michael, the guy who sold us the house?" she asked casually, taking another sip of her wine. My mind raced back to the tall, charismatic real estate agent with the perfect smile and impeccable suits. He had been friendly, overly friendly now that I think about it. At the time, I just chalked it up to his sales persona. "Yeah, him," she continued. "It started not long after we bought this place. He's rich, Tom. A millionaire." There it was. The cliché, she had fallen for the flashy guy with money. My stomach churned, but she wasn't done yet. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, although I could hear a lack of remorse in her voice. "But after we moved in, Michael kept checking in, making sure everything was okay with the house. It was innocent at first, but then things escalated. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My wife, the woman I had loved and trusted for 7 years, had been having an affair with Michael, a millionaire. I should have seen it coming, but I had been blind. I hadn't noticed the signs, the late nights, the unexplained absences, the secretive texts. But now, sitting across from her, it all made sense. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't trying to justify it. She was just stating the facts. "He made me feel alive, Tom," she said bluntly, no softness in her voice. "You're a good guy, but you're boring. Routine. Safe. Michael, he's exciting. He took me places, bought me things. He made me feel like I was someone else. Someone important." My hands clenched into fists under the table, but I forced myself to stay calm. "How long?" I asked, barely able to get the words out. 5 years, she said without hesitation. 5 years. She had been with him for nearly our entire marriage. My mind reeled, trying to process the betrayal, but she didn't stop. "And it's not just him." My head snapped up. "What?" "There have been others," she said, her tone cold and unapologetic. "A few, actually, but none of them meant anything. Just flings. Michael's the only one who mattered." I felt like I was going to be sick. How could she sit there, so calm, so indifferent, and tell me this, like it was no big deal? The woman I had loved and trusted for years was now a complete stranger to me, a monster I couldn't recognize. I couldn't just sit there and listen anymore. I stood up, pacing around the kitchen, trying to make sense of it all. Jessica remained in her chair, watching me with a bored expression, as if this was just another conversation, another argument. "How could you do this?" I finally asked, my voice shaking with rage. We've been together for 7 years. I've given you everything. I thought we were happy. Were we, though? She shot back, her voice cold. You were happy, Tom, but I wasn't. I've been bored for years, suffocating in this boring life with you. You don't excite me anymore. Michael does. He made me feel alive. I stared at her in disbelief. So you cheated on me for 5 years because I didn't excite you? Yes, she said bluntly, her eyes challenging me to argue with her. And if I'm being honest, I don't regret it. You've been so wrapped up in your own little world, your job, your hobbies, that you didn't even notice. And I needed something more. I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. My entire life, my marriage, everything I had believed in was a lie. And she didn't care. She didn't even seem sorry. But you didn't leave, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Why didn't you just leave if you were so unhappy? She shrugged. Because you're safe, Tom. You're the backup plan. If things didn't work out with Michael, or with anyone else, I knew I could always fall back on you. Her words hit me like a slap in the face. I had been nothing but a backup plan to her, a safety net. And now, after all these years, she was finally throwing it in my face. As if the night couldn't get any worse, there was a knock at the door. I turned to Jessica, confused. Who the hell is that? It's Michael, she said nonchalantly. I asked him to come over. He wants to talk to you. My blood boiled. She invited him here? I was about to tell her to go to hell when the door opened. And there he was, Michael, standing in my doorway, looking every bit the rich, smug bastard I now knew him to be. Tom, he said, stepping inside like he owned the place. I think we need to talk. I clenched my fists, ready to knock him out, but something in his tone stopped me. He didn't sound smug or arrogant. He sounded serious, and there was something else in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. I didn't know she was married, he said, his voice low. Not at first. She didn't tell me about you. My jaw dropped. She lied to him too? She said you were just a roommate, he continued, glancing at Jessica, who didn't seem the least bit ashamed. It wasn't until later that I found out the truth. By then, I was in too deep. Michael's confession sent a ripple through the room that shattered the fragile tension holding us together. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Jessica, my wife of 7 years, not only cheated but lied to this man as well. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for him, but the disgust quickly replaced any empathy I might have had. Jessica, sitting at the table, merely swirled the wine in her glass. A bored look still plastered on her face, as if this entire mess was just another Tuesday for her. I didn't lie, Jessica finally said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. I just didn't mention that I was married right away. Besides, you didn't ask, Michael. You were too busy trying to impress me with your bank account. Michael's jaw tightened. He clearly wasn't expecting her to be this callous in front of me, especially now that everything was coming out into the open. Jessica, this is madness, Michael muttered, rubbing his forehead. I thought we had something real, something more than just this. Real? She shot back with a cold laugh, finally standing up from the table. Nothing about this has ever been real, Michael. You were a distraction, like I told Tom, a thrill. You have money, and you can afford to keep a woman like me entertained. That's it. Did you honestly think I was going to leave my boring, safe husband for you? What playhouse in one of your penthouses? Please. Her words were brutal, but there was no denying her ruthlessness. She didn't try to soften the blow for either of us. She was laying out her version of the truth, and she was doing it with a savage, unapologetic ease. I turned to Michael, who now looked just as wrecked as I felt. It was clear he didn't know Jessica the way I thought I had. He had been just as much a victim of her manipulation as I was, if not more. How long did you think you could keep this up? I finally asked, my voice trembling with both rage and sorrow. How long were you going to lead both of us on? Jessica rolled her eyes, finishing the last of her wine. I don't know, Tom. I didn't really think that far ahead. I figured one of you would figure it out eventually. Michael stepped forward, finally breaking out of his stunned silence. I didn't know it was like this. She told me she was stuck in a dead marriage, that you were abusive. I snapped my head towards Jessica, my blood boiling. You told him I was abusive? She didn't even flinch. Well, what was I supposed to say? That my loving husband wasn't exciting enough, so I was screwing around with other men? I had to make myself look like the victim. It was at that moment that the full weight of her deception hit me. She had crafted a narrative for herself, one where she was the tragic heroine, trapped in a loveless marriage, using it as a justification for her selfish, destructive behavior. And it wasn't just Michael she had lied to. There were others. The more Jessica spoke, the more she seemed to unravel. It was like watching a dam break, her lies spilling out without any sense of remorse or guilt. She didn't even seem to care that her words were cutting both me and Michael to pieces. There were a few others, she admitted, as if she was talking about something as casual as ordering a pizza. Nothing serious, just men I met at the gym or when I was out with the girls. They were all just distractions. Distractions? I echoed, my voice a mix of disbelief and anger. You're telling me you've been cheating on me with random men for years, and they were just distractions? How many, Jessica? She shrugged, clearly uninterested in giving me a number. I don't know, maybe 3 or 4. Honestly, I lost count. But like I said, none of them mattered. Michael was the only one I kept around because he could afford to keep me interested. Michael looked like he had been punched in the gut. I almost felt bad for him. He had thought he was special, that he was different. But to Jessica, he was just another pawn in her twisted game. How could you do this? Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. You made me believe you cared about me. Jessica turned towards him, a cruel smirk tugging at the corners of her lips. I never said I cared about you, Michael. I let you think what you wanted to think because it benefited me. I got what I wanted from you, nice dinners, expensive gifts, trips. It was fun while it lasted, but I'm not going to apologize for using you. You let yourself get played. The coldness in her voice was staggering. I had never seen this side of Jessica before, this venomous, uncaring woman who clearly had no regard for anyone but herself. It was like she had worn a mask for years, and now that mask had finally slipped, revealing the monster underneath. As the weight of her betrayal settled over us, the front door suddenly swung open. Both Michael and I turned to see who it was, and standing in the doorway was a tall man, maybe in his late 30s, wearing a leather jacket and a smirk that made my stomach churn. He didn't bother knocking, didn't even hesitate to walk in like he owned the place. Ah, the happy couple, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he strolled into the kitchen. I didn't miss the party, did I? Jessica's face lit up in a way that made my heart sink. I knew instantly who he was before she even introduced him. This was another one of her distractions. Tom, this is Nate, she said with a wicked grin, not even attempting to hide her excitement. We've been seeing each other for a few months now. Nate, meet Tom, my husband. Nate gave me a nod, like we were old buddies, before turning to Jessica and pulling her in for a kiss. Right in front of me and Michael. My blood boiled. I couldn't believe the audacity, the sheer cruelty of what I was witnessing. Michael looked like he was going to be sick. Jessica, what the hell is this? Jessica pulled away from Nate, wiping her lips with the back of her hand before turning to Michael. Oh, come on, Michael. You didn't think you were the only one, did you? Nate's been around for a while now. He's different, edgier, more fun. Nate chuckled, leaning against the counter like he didn't have a care in the world. She's right. You two seem pretty soft. No offense. I wanted to hit him. I wanted to hit both of them. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the realization that none of this was worth it. That Jessica, and everything she represented, wasn't worth the fight anymore. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I felt a sense of clarity. Jessica wasn't the woman I had married. Or maybe she was, and I had just never seen her for who she really was. Either way, the life we had built together, the 7 years of marriage, the trust, the love, it was all a lie. I turned to Jessica, who was now casually draped across Nate's chest, her eyes daring me to say something, to fight back. But I couldn't. I'm done, I said, my voice hollow but resolute. I'm done with this. With you. Jessica shrugged, clearly unbothered. Good. It's about time. I turned to Michael, who looked just as shattered as I felt. You should leave too, man, I told him quietly. She's not worth it. Michael nodded slowly, his eyes filled with regret and pain. Without another word, he turned and walked out the door, leaving Jessica and Nate behind. I followed him, not even bothering to look back. Walking out of that house felt like leaving behind a nightmare I had been trapped in for years. The cool night air hit my face, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe. Michael stood on the sidewalk, staring at the pavement as if the ground might open up and swallow him whole. We didn't say anything for a while. Both of us were too consumed by the weight of everything that had just happened. I finally broke the silence. What the hell are we supposed to do now? Michael shook his head, his hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his tailored coat. I don't know, man. I thought I knew her. I thought she was just stuck in a bad marriage, but it turns out she's just rotten inside. He wasn't wrong. Jessica wasn't just a liar. She was cruel. She had used both of us for her own gain, played us against each other, and had the audacity to introduce her latest fling into our lives like it was no big deal. I could barely wrap my head around it, but one thing was certain. I was done. I had no intention of staying in her twisted little world for another second. I'm filing for divorce first thing in the morning, I said, my voice firm, even though inside I felt like I was barely holding it together. I don't care about the house, the car, none of it. She can have it. I just want to be done with her. Michael looked over at me, a mixture of pity and camaraderie in his eyes. I get it. I was going to offer you something, like financial help, but it seems like you're already set on walking away. I appreciate it, but no, I replied, running a hand through my hair. This isn't about the money. I can't even look at her again. We stood in silence for a few more minutes before Michael gave me a firm pat on the back. Well, I guess this is it. Time to move on. It was such a simple statement, but the truth of it was undeniable. Moving on wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only option left. For the next few weeks, everything moved in a blur. I filed for divorce the next morning as promised and started moving out of the house. Jessica didn't even seem to care. She signed the papers without a fight and barely acknowledged me when I came by to collect my things. Nate had practically moved in at that point, lounging around like the house was his personal playground. But just when I thought it was over, Jessica had one last card up her sleeve. A few days after the divorce was filed, I started getting messages from mutual friends. At first, they were just confused texts asking if everything was okay. Then the messages became more pointed, accusing me of things I had never done. It didn't take long to realize what was happening. Jessica was spreading rumors, nasty ones. She told everyone that I had been emotionally abusive, controlling, that I had isolated her from her friends and treated her like property. None of it was true, of course, but the damage was done. People believed her, or at least they were willing to entertain the idea. After all, Jessica had always been charming and convincing. She knew how to play the victim, how to twist the truth just enough to make herself look like the hero of her own story. It didn't matter that I had been the one betrayed. She had already spun the narrative in her favor. First, I tried to fight back. I tried to defend myself, to set the record straight, but it was like shouting into a void. The more I tried to explain, the more guilty I seemed. It was as if people were waiting for me to slip up, to admit that some part of what she said was true. It was maddening, but there was nothing I could do, and Jessica knew it. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I received an unexpected message from Michael. We hadn't spoken since that night, but his message was brief and to the point. Meet me. We need to talk. I wasn't sure what to expect. Maybe he was angry, or maybe he had more bad news. But when I met him at a local coffee shop, he looked surprisingly calm. I've been thinking about things, he began, sitting down across from me. About Jessica, about everything she's done. And I think I know how we can turn this around. I raised an eyebrow, skeptical. Turn this around? What are you talking about? Michael leaned forward, lowering his voice. Jessica's been playing us for years, right? using us, manipulating us. She thinks she's won, but I'm not about to let her get away with it. I've got connections, Tom, powerful ones. And I think it's time we show her that we're not the fools she thinks we are. I blinked, trying to process what he was saying. You want to, what? Get revenge? Michael shook his head. Not revenge. Justice. Jessica's been lying to everyone, and she's used us to build her little empire of lies. I've been doing some digging, and it turns out she's not as clever as she thinks she is. She's been embezzling money from one of the companies I own. Small amounts, but enough to make it illegal. My heart skipped a beat. This was big. Jessica could actually be held accountable for something. What are you saying? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm saying, Michael continued, that if you're willing to help me, we can bring her down. I'll make sure she doesn't walk away from this unscathed. She can't keep using people like this and get away with it. For a moment, I hesitated. I had told myself I was done with Jessica, that I wanted to move on. But the thought of her facing consequences for everything she had done, it was tempting. And deep down, I knew I couldn't just walk away and let her ruin someone else's life. What do you need me to do? I finally asked. Michael's smile was grim. Leave that to me. Michael's plan was simple yet brilliant. He had spent the last few weeks gathering evidence of Jessica's embezzlement, bank records, wire transfers, emails. He had it all. But instead of going straight to the authorities, he wanted to confront her first. He wanted to give her a chance to confess, to own up to what she had done. If she refused, then we would go public with everything. We decided to confront her at a charity gala she was attending with Nate. It was the perfect setting, public, high profile, and filled with people who had believed her lies. If she didn't confess, her fall from grace would be spectacular. The night of the gala, I stood outside the venue with Michael, my heart pounding in my chest. Part of me couldn't believe I was going through with this, but I knew it was the right thing to do. Jessica needed to be held accountable. She won't see it coming, Michael said, his eyes fixed on the entrance. She thinks she's untouchable, but tonight, that's going to change. As we walked inside, I spotted Jessica almost immediately. She was draped in a designer gown, her arm hooked around Nate's, laughing with a group of socialites as if she didn't have a care in the world. For a moment, I felt a pang of anger. How could she be so carefree after everything she had done? Michael and I made our way over to her, and as soon as she saw us, her smile faltered. She quickly composed herself, though, flashing that same charming grin that had fooled so many people. Tom! Michael! She greeted us, her voice sickly sweet. What are you doing here? Michael didn't waste any time. We need to talk, Jessica. Her eyes flicked to me, then back to Michael. She could sense something was wrong, but she wasn't quite sure what. Talk about what? She asked, her voice still light, but there was a hint of unease creeping in. Michael stepped closer, his voice low but firm. About the money you've been stealing. About the lies you've been telling. Jessica's smile froze. For the first time in years, she looked genuinely scared. At first, Jessica tried to play it off. She laughed, as if Michael had just told a bad joke. But the look in her eyes told a different story. She knew she was trapped. I have no idea what you're talking about, she said, her voice shaking ever so slightly. You're being ridiculous. Michael pulled out his phone, showing her the evidence he had collected, screenshots of bank statements, emails, everything. Jessica's face went pale, and I could see the panic setting in. This is absurd, she hissed, her voice low as she glanced around, hoping no one was listening. You can't prove anything. Oh, I think we can, Michael replied calmly. And if you don't come clean, we'll make sure everyone here knows what you've done. For a moment, Jessica looked like she was going to fight back, but then something in her broke. She let out a shaky breath, her shoulders slumping in defeat. Fine, she muttered, barely loud enough for us to hear. I did it. I took the money, but I had my reasons. Michael raised an eyebrow. Reasons? Jessica shot him a glare. You wouldn't understand. With her confession in hand, Michael and I wasted no time. Within days, the authorities were involved. and Jessica's carefully crafted world began to crumble. She was charged with embezzlement, and the public turned on her faster than I could have imagined. The same friends who had believed her lies, who had helped spread rumors about me, now wanted nothing to do with her. Nate, of course, was gone the moment things got difficult. He left her high and dry, moving on to his next conquest without a second thought. It was ironic. Jessica had spent years using people, and in the end, she was the one who was used and discarded. Watching her fall from grace was satisfying, but it wasn't enough to heal the wounds she had caused. It took time, therapy, and a lot of soul-searching to start rebuilding my life. I had lost so much because of her, but in the end, I had gained something even more valuable: freedom. It's been a year since Jessica's downfall, and my life is finally starting to feel normal again. The divorce was finalized, and I've moved into a new place, far away from the house we once shared. Michael and I have stayed in touch, and while neither of us like to talk about what happened, there's a sense of solidarity between us. We both survived Jessica's web of lies, and that's something. As for Jessica, the last I heard, she was still trying to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. I don't know where she is now, and I don't really care. All I know is that she's out of my life for good. Looking back, I realize how lucky I am to have escaped when I did. Jessica may have broken my heart, but she didn't break me. And for that, I'm grateful. Life goes on, and so do I.